Stephen King is a pretty unique author in a category all his own. He's an author who's predominantly known for writing horror fiction, and he's been doing so for 50 plus years. The guy is an institution in Western literature, American literature, horror literature, thrillers. He is one of the biggest names in fiction across the entire world, and that has been the case for decades. But when you look at the kinds of books that he writes from various different angles, it's kind of wild how he's managed to do that, because he's gone against multiple grains. Outside of independent publishing, the wider publishing industry is not particularly well known for taking risks. And yet, when you look at Stephen King's library of works, all you really see are risks. And they have paid off massively. Because by every single metric, Stephen King is wildly successful in terms of sales, in terms of critical reception, in terms of film and comic adaptations. The guy is an institution, a household name, and yet it sometimes feels like none of that should have worked out for him. And so I'm going to explore that here and now. Not so much the history of his works, because I haven't read them all and I haven't seen all the film adaptations, but rather I want to look at his style of writing, the genres that he explores, the kinds of themes that he explores, why all of that stuff doesn't seem like it should work, and yet it does. Stephen King keeps getting away with it, and I want to understand how and why. Now, the book that I've just been wildly waving around in the air is The Stand, and I just read The Stand, and I feel like it's a very, very good book to examine when talking about the strangeness of Stephen King. Because for one thing, The Stand is enormous. This is a 1,200-page epic. Although, to be fair, it wasn't when it was first published. Upon its initial publication in 1978, The Stand was 400 pages shorter than it is now. And unsurprisingly, it's quite hard to get your hands on one of those shorter original versions of The Stand. Because 11 years later, in 1989, King was given the opportunity to revise this book, and he made it 50% longer. Now, this 1,200-page version of The Stand is normal. This is the version I read, it's the version most of us will have read. That in itself is odd, but I think it speaks to the privilege of Stephen King. When you're as successful as him, you get to do this kind of stuff with your fiction. You get to tinker with it, edit it, do kind of director's cut versions of your books. There's publicity in doing it. There is an uptick in sales. There are opportunities not just for newer copies, but maybe fresh adaptations based on the updated version. But the fact that he did it all the same is kind of crazy. This book is over 1,000 pages long. It is, as far as I can think, the longest book I have ever read, apart from lengthy series and trilogies and that kind of thing. But as a standalone book, 1,200 pages, it's enormous. And this thing has sold millions of copies. So many of his books have sold millions of copies. This is considered by so many people to be his epic magnum opus. And it's a relatively early book in his canon as well. So the length of his books is the first thing I'd like to address when we talk about how he gets away with it. Stephen King writes massive, beefy books fairly often. Another 1,000-page book of his is It, which is one of my favorite novels of all time. Salem's Lot is about 800 pages long. The Dark Tower is a series of, I think, 7 books. I only read 4 of them before I started getting really bored and annoyed. But those books are all, apart from the first one, longer than average. They're huge epics, each and every one of them, adding up to one incredible series. That is just one thing in his enormous library of works. And aside from its length, The Dark Tower is incredibly bizarre. A blend of epic fantasy, urban fantasy, horror, thriller, and other things besides. The Dark Tower is weird as It is cosmic horror. It is bizarre, multi-dimensional urban fantasy. It's a western. It's a mystery story. It is also something that strangely ties into the broader universe of his books. It has a villain character that was introduced in The Stand, which is a standalone book. As far as I can remember, the 4th Dark Tower book, which is a prequel to the other ones that just sits right in the middle of the whole series, is partially set in the universe where Pennywise Pennywise, the villain from It, comes from. I think I'm remembering that right. You can correct me in the comments. There is a web, a network, an entire multiverse of stories that Stephen King has created that intersect and interweave with our own universe and others besides. It's weird stuff. There is a surrealism to his fiction, and it's all really long. So many of his books are massive, much longer than your average book. And that is a turn-off for so many readers. I read and write and talk about books for a living, and I am not a big fan of long fiction. That was initially what I wanted to talk about when I conceived of this video topic. I actually just wanted to talk about how he gets away with writing epic, long, massive, 1,000+ page books that I enjoy as someone who doesn't typically enjoy lengthy novels. What is it about him that makes him different? I think it's so unusual how he can write against the grain. And beyond the length of his books and the surreal strangeness of his books, we've got the fact that horror fiction is relatively niche in other mediums. Aside from the Resident Evil series, when it comes to video games, horror is just not as profitable as other genres of video games. A survival horror game is never going to perform as well as a first-person shooter or a Japanese role-playing game. And this is even more true in the realm of Hollywood cinema. Horror movies are so often made on smaller budgets and make smaller profits, but an interesting thing about horror film is that because they're made on smaller budgets, they often make a larger profit in terms of the gap between budget and profit. It's usually enormous. They turn a huge profit because of how cheap they are to make. But they're typically low budget because big studios often don't have a lot of faith in the horror genre. It's pretty niche. People who love horror films are obsessed with them. They make them their entire personalities. And I'm one of them. I get it. But typically, liking horror is niche. It is not mainstream to enjoy horror. And yet, when you look at books and the publishing landscape, Stephen King is one of the biggest names in the history of fiction. And he is primarily a horror author. All of his most successful books, especially early in his career, the books that come off the top of your head when you think Stephen King, they're all horror. Carrie, It, Cujo, Salem's Lot, The Shining, Pet Sematary, Misery. I could go on and on, you get my point. These books are enormously successful and they are all terrifying horror novels. People love Stephen King, and yet horror is supposed to be a pretty small niche, especially when compared to mystery novels, fantasy novels, romance novels. Horror doesn't compete in terms of sales, in terms of broader appeal, and yet we have Stephen King. So his books are way longer than average. They are in a genre, typically, that isn't as popular. He does really strange and wacky and surreal things, like with The Dark Tower, and yet he's so insanely successful. Why? How? Well, let's turn our attention to The Stand, and I think this book can answer some of those questions. Okay, so I had to take a little break to charge my camera battery and also cool down because it's a heat wave in Scotland right now. Where was I? What was I doing? The Stand, yes. Okay, so The Stand is a great example of how Stephen King pulls it off, how he is constantly going against the grain and yet being an enormous success. And it's actually a pretty simple answer. Stephen King's success as a writer is all down to how he writes his characters. The man has come up with some incredible scenarios and plots. There's no denying that. But it's the people that he puts into those scenarios, the people he puts through those stories that really stick with you and elevate his stories every single time. Although when it comes to his short stories, that's a little bit different because short stories are pretty often defined by a concept or a theme that gets explored very quickly and concisely, which is, I think, part of the reason why his short stories are some of his scariest stories. And that's often the case. So many of my favorite horror stories are actually short stories and novellas, because they cram so much in. It's more like watching a horror movie, where you have just an hour of scares, rather than spending 50 hours with a cast of Incredibly diverse and well-developed characters. And this isn't just true for Stephen King. So many of the biggest names in film and prose are people who create characters that we come to love. Look at comic books. Most people read superhero comics because they enjoy those superheroes. Look at the works of Charles Dickens. It's his characters that we remember so well. Terry Pratchett, the Discworld. His characters are the most beloved elements of his stories. If you ask somebody what their favorite Terry Pratchett book is, they're probably going to think based on characters. Is it Rincewind? Is it Granny Weatherwax? Is it Death? And it's the same for Stephen King, but the way that he writes his characters is so wonderfully unique because he manages to toe a wonderful line between caricature and relatable person. And here's what I mean. His characters almost feel like caricatures in the sense that you can get to know them almost immediately. There are archetypal elements to every single Stephen King character. There will be perhaps an emotion that a character expresses very, very clearly upon first meeting them. Something about them that comes to define them, but not entirely. Maybe just at first, or maybe it just colors them a certain shade. Maybe a character is quick to anger, and so you picture them as red. That's not all they are. There are 100 shades of red, and also some orange and some pink in there as well. But the red is there at the center. So we meet a character who is quick to anger. We put them in a scenario where their anger is challenged. Being angry is difficult, maybe dangerous. They become frustrated. They become defined by their anger until they're put through a situation where their anger has to shift or disappear entirely, and then they become fleshed out. They begin as an archetype, a caricature, but they quickly expand into something else. And so we latch onto his characters quickly because there is some relatable element, some primary color, some very simple, easy to define element to their characteristics. And then they blossom. They become more complex with the story, through their relationships with other characters, through their relationship to the story itself, and what they're put through. And when it comes to horror, people are put through some horrible shit all the time. And that is absolutely the case with The Stand, because The Stand is a work of post-apocalyptic fiction. But what's so brilliant about The Stand is the fact that the apocalypse is unraveling gradually. We have an enormous cast of characters, but when we first meet them, for the first several hundred pages of this book, they are just people living their lives. There's a teenage girl living in a small town in Maine who has gotten herself pregnant. And right at the beginning of the book, we watch her have a conversation with her parents. We see the way that each of her parents react slightly differently. Her mother being the most furious. Her mother being a God-fearing Christian who wants to kick her out of the house. This is a relatable scenario. We understand this kind of mother, the kind of father, the kind of teenage girl who gets into this situation. We sympathize with her. We worry about her. And then soon enough, when this flu pandemic begins that ends up wiping out 99% of all people, we watch as she is immune and her parents both die. And because her father was the kinder one, we watch her bury him in the garden. And after she buries him, she meets one of her neighbors who was also a classmate. And he is horribly relatable as well. He is a stuffy, pretentious, bookish nerd. This kid kind of reminded me of Ignatius J. Riley from A Confederacy of Dunces. Someone who's convinced himself he's smarter than everyone around him, and yet he's so obviously a loser. These people are archetypical. They are so quick to latch onto and understand. And this leads me to something else that I often struggle with Stephen King, which is that his characters can be pretty unlikable. Now, as a fan of Gothic fiction, I'm very used to unlikable people. I talk about this all the time. Characters in Dracula, Frankenstein, Wuthering Heights. These are horrible people doing horrible things all of the time. But with Gothic fiction, there is something so fantastical. There is something so bleakly, campily, pulpily strange about Gothic fiction that we are able to separate ourselves from it a little bit. See it from a distance. And yet Stephen King invites us into his world. You sometimes feel like you're nose to nose with his characters. You have to know them so intimately. And when they're horrible people, it makes it very uncomfortable. Makes you itchy. And sometimes I get upset with the amount of sexism in his books, but it isn't a Murakami-style sexism. It is because King is always writing his characters with shades of grey. And he manages to tilt the balance nicely when it comes to his sexism by writing female characters who are as morally grey and as complex as any of his men. And so we forgive him. We understand what he's trying to do. He writes sexist men because men are sexist, not because he is. And it's something that for some reason took a while to click for me. So we get up close and personal with these characters who are at first so archetypical and caricatured, and then we are forced to get to know them no matter how awful they are, or how morally grey they might be, because they're human. And that is in itself uncomfortable. But it's also why character-driven stories are so important, because we are social creatures. And of course, we're going to hone in on characters more than anything else, because we want to bond. Humans are always bonding with other humans. It's what we do. We are so social. Even if you're an introvert, you are still someone who values personality, who values people and their behavior. We do not exist in a vacuum. We exist amongst each other. And so when you read a work of fiction, you latch on to people. It's why so often we want our characters to be lovable, because we want to bond with them. We want to admire them. We want to aspire to be like them or imagine ourselves as their friend or their lover. But Stephen King doesn't always allow that. So rarely does he allow anything like that to happen. Instead, he forces you into uncomfortable situations with uncomfortable people who you can massively relate to, or at least understand, or at least attach them to something recognizable. They remind you of somebody you know, somebody you might not like. You recognize them so clearly and so simply. They are, as I said, one shade, one specific shade that you attribute to them until it becomes something else entirely. A multitude of shades. These people contain multitudes. And the length of his books does so much to elevate that entire experience. As I said before, we begin The Stand in an ordinary version of our world until a flu pandemic gradually spreads, and it really is gradual. The first half of the book takes place over the course of just a few days. The flu spreads so quickly in the grand scheme of things, but you're reading a book. Books skip ahead. This one almost doesn't. It forces you to sit with this experience and therefore sit with the characters who are going through this experience. We watch them walk. We watch them get injured. We watch them get confused. We watch them get into arguments and fights and disagreements over the situation they're in. And those disagreements can lead to death. When these people don't work together, they end up abandoning each other, or one person just gets an infection and dies from it, and another person is forced to bury them. And we feel their pain. Because every single character, no matter how long they're in the story for, is someone we've come to viscerally understand. We picture them so clearly in our minds, we can hear their voices. And that's another thing that King does, is he so often attributes accents to people. Think about Pet Sematary, and the character of Judd, I think his name's Judd, the guy with the very distinctly Maine accent. That guy.
I live just across the road. You want to watch out for that road.
He does it with so many of his characters all of the time. And he has a lot of fun with it in The Stand because The Stand is set across so many different states. Again, I don't want to get into the later half of the book. I don't want to spoil anything, but I don't need to because very early in the book, we begin in California before ending up in Texas and then flitting over to Maine, where Stephen King is from very famously. And we also spend quite a bit of time in the first quarter in New York City with a guy who's from California. He meets a woman in Central Park. He says goodbye to his mother in Manhattan. Central Park is in you know what I mean. We get to know these people and we also get to know these places. And as the world falls apart, we continue to know them. We know their changes, we know their struggles, we know their relationships. And because King writes characters so well and continues to develop those characters, I am never bothered by how long his books are because I just continue to enjoy these people. I just like spending time with them. I'm a big fan of D&D podcasts, and D&D podcasts are very long. Each episode can be 2 or 3 hours, and there might be 100 episodes in a campaign. That's 300 hours that I'm spending with a group of comedians playing a group of characters, rolling dice and going on weird adventures that they come up with off the tops of their heads. But it's the parasocial relationship that I'm forming with these people and their characters. And it's the same with the Stephen King book. I get to know these characters right off the bat. They are archetypical, and then they grow in their complexity, and on I go with them in this story. And I think actually, The Stand is a good example, but It is even better, because It has a group of 5 characters, and we meet these characters first as children and then as adults. And in the novel, we flip back and forth between those 2 versions of them. And it is so engrossing to watch these kids go on adventures trying to defeat a strange alien clown monster, and then have them as adults who are traumatized by those experiences, who are now unrecognizable in some ways, who are in their own horrible adult situations, abusive relationships, failed careers, agoraphobics who don't leave their homes. And those adult versions of themselves are inspired by the experiences that we're still reading about in the child chapters. And the child chapters are all about growth. They're about puberty and change, about relationships forming and breaking apart, about bonds solidifying. And so, of course, we are so engaged with the plots of these children and adults as we move through their lives with them for 1,000 pages. And I don't feel the time go by. It's so important to have these characters inform your connection to the plot. And another author that I can think of that pulls this off so well is George R.R. Martin. Because while we as readers so often heap praise on the Song of Ice and Fire books for the world building and for the political intrigue, we wouldn't care half as much if we didn't have characters within that world engaging in this political intrigue, this Game of Thrones, who are so well defined in their own right. In the first book, A Game of Thrones, Ned Stark is one of the most archetypical fantasy heroes, and yet there is a darkness to him. He has so many mistakes and regrets and scars that he wears openly that we get to know even more deeply, only for him to be killed off at the end of the book. He is our main character, and he is complex, but still easy to read. And then he's dead. And then there are so many others. The journey we go on with Jaime and Cersei Lannister is insane. These characters, once again, are so understandable, so clear in our minds. We can see them, we can understand them. We hate them, and yet we are addicted to them and intrigued by them through their dialogue, through their interactions with each other. They are complex, and yet each of them is a color with 1,000 hues of that color inside of them. It's so beautiful. And so when we talk about Game of Thrones, we often think about specific characters that we love. Characters like Arya Stark, characters like Tyrion Lannister, characters that we love to hate, like Cersei. I so love these characters, and I wouldn't love Game of Thrones half as much if it wasn't for these people that Martin writes so fucking well. It's all down to how the characters are written and the journeys that they go on. And it means that Stephen King can write terrifying horror stories, hugely lengthy books that don't ever seem to end, and at no point do any of us mind. We find ourselves flipping through these pages, hundreds upon hundreds of pages of absolutely terrifying, nail-biting scenarios in a genre that is supposed to be pretty niche, all because we are so enthralled by the characters, their relationships to each other, and the journeys that they go on. It is absolutely remarkable. The secret to Stephen King's success. The way that he so often gets away with doing things that publishing would not deem a successful metric for success. The way that he does it all is by writing characters who are human, uncomfortably human, clear, relatable archetypes, caricatures who then settle into a form that we understand and only blossom with complexity over time. It is incredible. And The Stand is such a marvelous example of all of that. Gosh, he's amazing. I've gone back and forth when it comes to my relationship with Stephen King. There are things I love and things I don't like. And yet I always end up coming back to him when I want a juicy story that is terrifying, but full of characters that I know are going to be massively unique, but also relatable and understandable, and will also grow and change with this lengthy story. There's nobody who does what he does the way he does it. And that's how he gets away with it. It's all down to the characters. It's so impressive. If you've enjoyed this video, if you're a Stephen King fan, then you're probably a horror fan, and that means you should read my book. This is a collection of queer horror stories that I wrote. They are very uncomfortable, they're full of body horror and creepy weirdness, and very political themes about the transgender experience. There are links in the description to Managing and Other Lies. Please consider picking up a copy and support me on Patreon if you're able to. $1 a month from you changes my entire life and welcomes you into a wonderful community of diverse bookworms. So please, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Thank you in advance. Pick up my book. Love you. Love Stephen King. Subscribe for books.